Hello, my name is Stephen Payson, and I'm presenting here a summary of my book that just came out entitled The Downsizing of Economics Professors, How It Will Happen and Why It Will Succeed. Please note that this presentation and the book itself reflect my own views but do not necessarily reflect the views of any organization to which I belong. This presentation may be freely used for educational and training purposes with the accreditation that is shown in this slide. For a 30% discount on the book, see the website shown here. I feel I should issue a warning about this presentation, which is that it addresses a subject that is very dear to some people's hearts, and economics professors tend to have very strong views on this topic. For example, when I presented this paper once before at a conference, one person in the audience got extremely angry at what I was saying, and she shared her anger very forcefully at the session. So I will not be surprised if some people are angered by this presentation, and that's fine, that's everyone's right. But all I would say is that I hope we can focus on objective and scientific truth as it may relate to the issues that I discuss, as opposed to being angry over issues that we may personally dislike at a superficial or emotional level. I strongly believe that, as many others do as well, that the number of economics professors now teaching at universities will decline substantially over the next couple of decades. This will happen for one main reason: the advent of distance learning, especially in the form of massive open online courses, MOOCs, which enable a single professor to lecture to tens of thousands of students. One clarification that I would like to make is that in this presentation and in the book itself, I talk about distance learning and MOOCs and other mechanisms like them in a very general sense. So, for example, I may use here the word MOOCs interchangeably to mean MOOCs per se and/or other forms of distance learning. So let's not quibble over the distinction between these different forms of distance learning. I am talking here about the very broad general concept of distance learning, replacing brick and mortar traditional classrooms. With regard to the effects of distance learning, other academic fields will undoubtedly encounter similar reductions in their numbers of professors. However, as I discuss in the book, academic economics is the one profession that is most qualified to study and address the topic. It is the one profession that should best recognize the economic benefits of this transition, which this book describes, and take responsibility for leading the transition among all academic fields. Let us begin by not kidding ourselves. Where do economics lectures come from? The fact that the vast majority of lectures in colleges today are still live, handmade, and in a single classroom is not the result of some optimization analysis that economists had conducted to determine what would be the best for the students in university. No, traditional classrooms, more than anything else, are merely historical artifacts of how original lectures could only be taught in the old days. In my parents' lifetime, they saw movies replace live theater because of the benefits of the economies of scale for movies, which could not yet be applied for classroom lectures. Those days are all over now. Distance learning and MOOCs are quite feasible, but we simply have not gotten around to making the adjustments yet. I'd like to speak for a moment about the profession's hypocrisy regarding Ludditism. As many of us know, Ludditism, from the Luddite movement, is a philosophy that is against the use of machines in production when those machines replace labor. The general consensus within the economics profession for a long time has been that Ludditism is wrong. I generally agree with that notion that it is wrong. I've lectured on it in classes that I've taught on the economics of technology, and I think on this particular topic, most economics professors are in agreement. This is not to say that there is, and well should be, a concern that automation does cause unemployment, which is definitely a problem. But it is not a problem that should be solved by outlawing automation, which is pretty much the Luddite position. So let us ask, what were economics professors saying when the internet caused the demise of the encyclopedia industry in the 1990s? Well, here's a hint. It was the same answer they gave when the telegraph replaced the Pony Express, when the computer replaced the calculator, and when the light bulb replaced the candle. Their answer: who cares? Economics professors would rightfully say that's just how technological change works, and that's okay because it makes us all better off in the long run. So if you lose your job as an encyclopedia salesman, that's your problem. But hey, chances are you'll find another job, probably even a better job, so no worries. But then, what goes around comes around. Now, what has been economics professors' reaction to the prospect of them being replaced by MOOCs? Well, many have complained fiercely about this. Some, for example, in a series of articles in American Economic Review in January 2014, to be precise, which I review in the book. The profession's response, in effect, has been, no, this is horrific. Keep those evil MOOCs away from me and my students. They will reduce the quality of education. Students will not be able to pay attention to learn. We will lose our prestigious academic institutions and way of life. And last but not least, we will lose our jobs. But the fact that this will make higher education in economics accessible and affordable to everyone, while actually increasing its quality, and students can still choose whether they want to have it or not, seems to have not been considered by those economics professors who have been complaining. Let us now resolve an enormous misconception about technological change. People should realize that technological change is a two-way street, not a one-way street. What I mean by this is that there is a common misconception that technological change only makes things faster, cheaper, or better for the consumer, while all else is equal. This is very often not the case, in fact. Technological change often requires more on the part of the consumer, but in exchange for making things cheaper or easier for the consumer in other ways. For example, as shown in these pictures, in the old days, people at train stations, bus stations, and even airports often did not carry their own luggage. And there was an entire common profession of porters to carry their luggage for them. Now we hardly see any porters anymore. What happened to them? Did they get replaced by android robots who now carry our luggage? No, they did not. They got replaced by the technological change associated with the invention and mass production of very hard plastics that allowed for little wheels on the bottom of luggage and very strong hinges for those little wheels, and other design innovations that have enabled people of average and below average strength to haul their own luggage. And now there are even motorized suitcases. It was worth it for consumers, not having to find porters to move their luggage, and most importantly, not having to pay them. But it meant people had to adjust to carrying their own luggage now. This is what I mean by a two-way street. Consumers got something that was very worthwhile, but they did not get it for nothing. When I was a small child, quite a long time ago, most office officials did not and could not type. There were professional typists in each office to do that for them, and typists whom students would hire to type their dissertations, etc. Since then, students and professionals have had to learn how to type for themselves, but again, it was worth it. Other examples: retail self-checkout scanning and bagging, booking your own plane tickets, hotels tickets, etc., ordering products online for yourself to be delivered, pumping your own gas in nearly all states, withdrawing money from a bank without a teller. The list goes on and on. And with these new skills that consumers need to learn, consumers benefited in the end, and our society has never looked back. And now the same applies to students today becoming better at paying attention to online classes. And they will, and it is happening now. And putting it quite simply, it is not a big deal. But in their hypocritical Luddite effort to save their own cushy jobs, many economics professors have been crying that distance learning is no good for economics education. In the next 5 slides, I will discuss the defensive weapons that they have launched against distance learning. Consider now the paying attention excuse for live lectures. The logical flaw in the argument is large enough to drive a truck through it. The argument is based on some findings that, all else being equal, with the same professor and lecture, some students pay better attention while sitting in a class than seeing the lecture online. But all else is not equal. That is, when the same boring professor is compared online and live, then maybe live is better. And when the same interesting professor is compared live and online, then again, live is better. But MOOCs allow us to replace the boring professor with the interesting online professor. So all else is not equal. MOOCs give us better professors on average, pure and simple. And it is quite likely that students will pay more attention to an interesting online professor made possible by a MOOC than a boring live professor. The dropout rate catastrophe. In case you haven't realized it yet, I am being completely sarcastic in my use of the word catastrophe here. It is not a catastrophe at all, but it has been described as a catastrophe by the economics professors who have been vocally opposed to MOOCs. Let us compare the following products, which take about the same amount of resources. A MOOC that offers a free course to 20,000 people who start to take the course, but only 5,000 people remain in the course to the end, a dropout rate of 75%. Say 4,000 of those 5,000 could not afford to take the class otherwise. And B, a brick and mortar course that is offered to 30 people, of which 3 drop out, a dropout rate of 10%. Does the higher dropout rate of the MOOC mean it was a worse course? Absolutely not. That would be absurd. As I argue in the book, the fact that a MOOC has a higher dropout rate says nothing about its quality. There is nothing wrong with anyone sampling a course without committing to it when the marginal cost of such sampling is 0 to the producer and to the consumer. Consumers sample all kinds of products all the time, allowing them to make the best consumption decisions. Economics classes are no different. Would society be better off from the same resources to produce 5,000 graduates of the course than to produce 30 graduates? As an economist, or simply as a person who could do second-grade arithmetic, I think society would be better off with the 5,000 graduates. The unique professor excuse. In the book, I argue that MOOCs worldwide would allow for a great variety in the frameworks and styles of good professors. Students in universities are therefore not forced into some kind of standardization in economics lectures. And besides, if standardization itself is such a crime, then why do professors use standardized textbooks rather than their own unique lecture notes? So the only real effect of MOOCs with regard to uniqueness would be that uniquely bad economics professors would no longer be needed to teach economics. And then there's the plea to save our precious, prestigious institutions. Some economics professors have argued that we need brick and mortar classrooms in order to keep the best and brightest students in a beautiful place for the best research and plentiful endowments. But for MOOCs, the best and brightest students can still be selected with the same criteria, in fact, for prestigious, advanced online courses. But what about our glorious college traditions, like kneeling before the porcelain god in the dormitory bathrooms at the end of a frat party, for example? I would argue that social networks among college students will still exist and new traditions will arise, such as the nature of human history. And besides, are the old traditions worth, say, $50,000 per year in college expenses for students to be able to enjoy those traditions? If you offered students $50,000 per year in extra income to take only online courses, how many would gladly accept? In my view, if we do not allow the students and their families to make the choices of cheaper distance learning, then those students are indentured servants to the university, not customers. And finally, some have argued that brick and mortar prestigious colleges are needed in order to keep the riffraff out, the riffraff being lower tier students. As I argue in my book, the exact opposite will happen. Online courses will level the playing field, denying the opportunity for many lesser able students who happen to come from rich families to graduate with a, quote, gentleman's C, unquote, as has remained the fine tradition of the most elite colleges. And there are actually some real benefits to MOOCs besides the much lower costs in terms of tuition and no need for campus housing or transportation to a brick and mortar classroom. As already mentioned, classes will be taught by professors who are much better than average, given the competition and rewards that would be involved in someone becoming a MOOCs professor. There would be more stimulated learning material, such as videos, and students would have the ability to watch and review the material when they were able to be most attentive. And students would be better able to control their own learning process, such as reviewing by rewinding a difficult part of a recorded lecture over and over again until they have learned it well. There is also the government's and society's responsibility in all of this. So who pays for college tuition? Only students, their families, and everyone else in the form of tax credits, especially student grants and government subsidization of student loans. To the extent that it is the government that pays for unnecessary tuition for handmade brick and mortar lectures, it is the government's responsibility to eliminate this wasteful and unnecessary spending of taxpayer money. The money saved could otherwise be spent on more worthwhile government projects or on reducing the budget deficit. Finally, we can approach the topic of how to create a safe landing for MOOCs and distance learning in economics. We should accept the fact that it will happen anyway, but we might as well help it happen faster and in a more equitable manner. Why not have free tuition, as other nations have, and as advocated recently by many political leaders? But instead of a free tuition policy financed through taxes and loss of other public spending, have it made possible through incredibly inexpensive online programs. It is time for the propaganda against MOOCs and distance learning, perpetuated by some economics professors, to end. We know better, and we need to do the right thing from an economic perspective and from the perspective of social responsibility.